And a very good afternoon. It has just turned 1 o'clock. You are watching or listening to Insight here on Raw 12:51 AM, depending on where you're getting your insight from, whether that's from our Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter streams live, or indeed on Mixcloud and Spotify, where you can catch up with any of our shows so you don't miss out. Very good afternoon. Hello to you. Thanks very much for tuning in. This is obviously I'd say quite a stressful time for a lot of students at the moment. Obviously, impending essays and exams. Probably many people didn't want me to say that right now, but there we go. We can't avoid it. Of course, for a politics student like me, it is the most ideal thing to do to take a break from writing a politics essay to then go into talking about politics on today's show. We've got a lot to run through. Of course, it's a big set of elections this week, so we'll be talking about that very soon, including what elections you as Warwick students can vote in and some of the big themes across the country. It was also Joe Biden's first 100 days last Friday, so we'll be talking a little bit about some of the successes, some of the challenges that face Joe Biden, and what lies ahead for the rest of the Biden presidency. Certainly been quite different from the Trump presidency, that must be said. Just very quickly as well, though, obviously Raw News has been putting out a lot of content over the last week. We had our interview with Johnny Jenkins speaking to Warwick SU President Luke Mepham, and we also had my interview with the winning University Challenge team. Please make sure you check them out. They're across all of our social medias, on our Facebook, on our Instagram, and on our Twitter, which is just very nicely scrolling along the bottom of the screen at the moment for our visual viewers. So again, please check these out and make sure to give a follow, a subscription, so you don't miss out on any of our content. Okay, well, let's now get going with the show and start off by bringing in my deputy head of news here at Raw 12:51 AM, Will Kingswood. Very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you too. Just getting back into exams and essays at the moment. I've got like 3 philosophy essays to write in the next week.
Oh, you have treated yourself very kindly there,
yeah,
I must say. There's a few questions I'm going to be asking all the guests today, because there's been I think, 2 very topical and divisive subjects from the last week. So very quickly, Will, firstly, what are your thoughts? I don't know if anyone saw Tony Blair's mullet, barnet. I've had many people call it different things. I'm not a hairdresser. I don't know if there are any hairdressers watching. Please comment. Tell me what it is. What did you think of Tony Blair's hair, though?
Unique, I think, is the first word I think of. I did enjoy on Twitter like the amount of comparisons that were being brought up. I think I saw David Icke, Peter Stringfellow at one point. It was quite shocking, because it's a big change from what it was when we saw him last.
I must say myself, I was getting a lot of Michael Heseltine vibes personally. And of course, speaking of Twitter feeds, one very divisive subject, and we aren't going to give any spoilers to anyone, including myself, who has never watched Line of Duty and may do so in the future. Do you have any thoughts on last night's episode?
I'm a bit like you. I've never really seen it. The only ways I've sort of been keeping up with it is on Gogglebox every week. It's always entertaining to see Jenny with her notepad just writing things down. But it was interesting, the reaction on Twitter last night.
I feel, isn't that what everyone does these days? Just, catch up on Gogglebox. There's so many shows I can say that for. Of course, last week we introduced our new little segment here on Insight, where we go through the news in 60 seconds. So, Will, I'm going to hand over to you, my friend. Take it away.
So obviously we had Boris Johnson's flat in the news. It's now being investigated by the Electoral Commission, but as to whether anything will come from that remains to be seen, especially because the Johnson government seems to have an ability to shy away from any sort of repercussions from any sort of scandal. Over in France, we had a group of French generals calling for military rule to combat the spread of Islamic fundamentalism, and which is quite an interesting thing, especially to see in France, because that's the sort of thing you'd see definitely not in Europe, and maybe in like Burma or somewhere like that. Then we had Biden's speech to Congress following his first 100 days, promising big spending throughout America. Obviously, it will be interesting to see how they're going to end up paying for that in the long run. And obviously, in America, they're still having big conflicts over the wearing of masks. Biden saying it's a patriotic act now, as opposed to sort of providing scientific rationale for it. And then obviously we had the Line of Duty finale last night, as we've just mentioned earlier. very controversial. It was very interesting to see the reaction on Twitter last night, but I won't go into it any further just in case people haven't seen it and want to. And that was the news in 60 seconds.
Thank you very much, Will. I have to say, my Twitter last night, I don't know if it's just because the fact that not obviously many sports clubs haven't been posting over the weekend, of course, joining in a boycott of social media over anti-racism within football, but also just in general as well. It was just everything last night. Facebook, Twitter, even Instagram was coming up with Line of Duty. I don't know. I feel like I'm really missing out on something.
I mean, it was just seemed like my For You Twitter feed was just like, it was just descriptive words about how the reaction was. I'm trying not to say more just in case people haven't seen it.
It is difficult, I think, to not give away spoilers. And of course, I just have to reply quickly to Enoch Mukungu, who has just commented in, no, Enoch, this is not an art show. It's just Line of Duty. Everyone's talking about Line of Duty. I feel we can give this a gratification of news. Of course, speaking of comments, if you are watching the show today, please leave your comments. Please get involved. There's a lot of things that we really want to hear your opinions about on today's show. So let's move on then. Let's start off by talking about, obviously, the local elections. And there is a lot of local elections. In fact, it's the biggest ever set of local elections taking place in this country. Of course, every election that was delayed because of the pandemic last year, taking place this year alongside many elections and that was scheduled for this year. Anyway, I believe it's the first ever time that the entire country is voting in a set of local elections on one day. Now, many people, turnout local elections isn't normally the highest in the world. Many people question its significance. So, Will, very quickly, why is it important to vote in a local election?
Well, I think it's important just because it is realistically the most direct form of government that we're going to have. It's the decisions that get made in your local area as opposed to getting made on a national scale. So if you want to have a say in that, you should definitely get out and vote in your local election.
No, absolutely. And of course, when it comes to local elections, there's a few things very quickly to run through. So firstly, depending on where you live on campus, you can vote in different local elections. So if you live on campus or if you live in Coventry, you're eligible to vote for Coventry City Council. You're eligible to vote for the West Midlands Mayor election, which we'll be talking about later, as well as the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner. The first election for the Cov City Council is like a general election. It's first past the post. You make one cross in the box. The other two elections take place under the supplementary vote system where you make a first and a second choice. In Leamington, you have elections for Warwickshire County Council, as well as if you live in Clarendon Ward, Warwick District Council, you also have the election of the Warwickshire Police and Crime Commissioner. And as well as that, you have the Royal Leamington Spa Neighbourhood Referendum Plan as well. Again, the County Council and District Council are first past the post. The Police and Crime Commissioner election, like in Coventry, uses the supplementary vote system with two preferences, and the referendum is a binary yes-no choice. You can find out more about the elections on the respective council websites, will be Coventry City Council, on Warwick District Council and Warwickshire County Council as well. And we'll also be putting up some links and reporting on some of the biggest stories in the local elections. Before we move on to start talking about some of these elections more specifically, Will, what are the key trends to look out for in this set of elections?
Well, I think so far this set of elections is sort of going to look like almost a referendum on Boris Johnson's support. Obviously, we've had the news in the last few weeks about his potential corruption within the Conservative Party with Greensill, with the Dyson issue, and with Boris Johnson's flat. So I think that will really make the difference. And if you see less Conservative support than may have been predicted, that might be the reason for it.
Okay, well, Will, we will see you again very soon. Let's move on now to talking about the first key election group that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about three groups, and let's start off in Hartlepool. Now, technically, yes, this is a local election, but this is a parliamentary by-election. And this, again, has quite significant ramifications, more widely linked to the 2019 election, but also a lot of the responses to that. So let's bring in now three people to discuss that. And again, before we start, I do have to very quickly get their opinions on of course, the importance of Tony Blair's hair and on line of duty as well. So let's start off with a Tees Valley native, Charlie Humphrey. Very good afternoon to yourself. Great to have you on. Firstly, Tony Blair's hair, line of duty, any comments?
Tony Blair, more like Tony Blair, and Line of Duty, never watched it, unfortunately.
I feel there will be many people right now who will be cursing at you. Sadly, we can't envisage any of that on air. Ollie Cranham-Young joins us now. Very good afternoon to you, Ollie. Same questions, Tony Blair's hair and line of duty.
Well, I don't criticise Tony it takes me a lot to criticise Tony, but his hair was, he looks terrible. I'm surprised Cherie didn't say something to him. And Line of Duty, I kind of watched it.
Again, some very more disappointed people there, Ollie. And finally, our former station manager, pleased to have her on today, Sian Bolton. Very good afternoon. Firstly, Tony Blair's hair and line of duty. What are your thoughts?
I like Tony Blair's hair. I think it looks nice. I think everyone's being really mean. And then line of duty, I've also not seen it, but my boyfriend's mum WhatsApped me her disappointment last night. So I don't know if that means anything.
I feel the consensus here right now is we all need to start watching Line of Duty, which of course we'll have plenty of time to do in about a month or so. Right, let's get going now on Hartlepool. Charlie, let's I guess firstly start off with the 2019 election, because I guess that's really the place to start with this.
Yeah.
The rest of the Northeast was part of the red wall that fell to the Conservatives in the last election. Hartlepool was an exception to the rule. Now, you live in Darlington. You're in one of those seats that fell in the last election. What do you think the chances are that Hartlepool could turn Conservative on Thursday?
I feel like Hartlepool is despite being very close, it's a very different area. There's definitely a lot more economic disparity in Hartlepool than there is in Darlington. Darlington is kind of like a bit bougie now. But I think the changes that have been happening, along with the Teesside mayoral election, it's been seen like the Tories have been doing a decent job in the North, which I kind of disagree with. But it looks like there's not as much certainty that Hartlepool will vote Labour. I feel like there is a strong possibility it'll vote Tory now and just fit in with the rest of the North now.
Well, it's important to say recent polling has given the Conservatives, I believe, about a 5 to 7 point lead in Hartlepool. Of course, Darlington, you mentioned, Darlington has previously had a Conservative MP before 2019, I believe, between 1983 and 1992 under Thatcher. Hartlepool, I don't believe, has ever had a Conservative MP. So that would be rather monumental.
This would be the first time Hartlepool would vote Tory. And that would be it'd be a shock, to be honest. Hartlepool is just Labour. No one's ever thought about it recently ever not being Labour. And it makes sense because it's a very working class, very industrious area. So voting Tory, which is very, very uncharacteristic of the constituency, would be monumental.
Well, Ollie, again, you have campaigned previously in many of these similar seats. And of course, I guess there's two real key trends that run through here. Firstly, of course, Boris Johnson's emphasis upon the levelling up agenda, of course, the hangover potentially from the Brexit vote as well, and potentially the vaccine rollout. I guess that's one story you could bring on, but also the story surrounding Keir Starmer's leadership and trying to win back those seats that were lost in the last election. So I guess my question to you is, how do you think the election result will reflect upon Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer?
Well, I think the optics of it, if Labour don't win it, will be terrible because, as Charlie just said, it's been a Labour seat for God knows how many decades, and if they don't win it and win it comfortably, it won't be evidence enough, I don't think, that Labour has moved on from the 2019 result. I mean, there's 10,000, I think, Brexit Party votes that are essentially up for grabs, and I just don't think that Keir Starmer has, since he became leader, has done enough to convince most of those people, those 10,000 people say, to vote Labour again. So I think for that reason, I think the Tories will win it. And I mean, as I say, anything other than a comfortable Labour victory will be seen as a damning indictment, I think, on their leadership. But I think there are questions to be asked about the candidate that Labour have chosen as well. I think this guy called Paul Williams, who used to be an MP for, I think, somewhere else in the Northeast, and obviously
Stockton South, just down the road.
There we go. And I know I think he was seen as quite a big Remainer throughout the last Parliament as well. So I think that's going to help either. That's not going to resonate very well. But I think they're just kind of holding out on the hope that because he's a doctor, that might kind of swing he'll appear as a doctor on the ballot paper, that might swing a few more votes towards him. But no, as I said, I think the Tories will win it, and it's not going to. The optics of it will be terrible for Labour.
Okay, well, I guess let's follow on from that point because, of course, one of the big spoiler effects in Hartlepool in 2019, arguably the reason it might not have turned Conservative, was that Brexit Party leader at the time, Richard Tice, very influential figure within the Brexit Party, stood in Hartlepool, gained 25% of the vote. Now, some have argued that stopped the Conservatives winning that seat last time out. So, Sian, do you think the fact that there's no sort of prominent third-party candidate this time helps the Conservatives? And do you think perhaps the particular issues that are on the agenda, if it's COVID, if it's Brexit, if it's levelling up, what sort of issues do you think are going to benefit either party?
Yeah, I think the Brexit Party not being on the poll is really interesting because I personally think that voters that went with the Brexit Party are looking for change in some way, and that can be split into two groups. That can be Conservative voting groups or Labour voting groups, but there's a clear kind of consensus in the north that Labour's not pulling their weight, and it's kind of frustrating to see that Labour could clearly see after 2019 that there's a problem with the north and how they're connecting with the north, and the north feeling listened to. And it seems like Keir Starmer's not made any kind of big gains in trying to reach out to that, which I think is interesting. I think what's going to be up for grabs is so different depending on the type of Brexit voter that you're looking at. But I think COVID is going to make all the difference with this one, and how whether people have thought the Conservatives have done well with COVID or people. The problem is Keir Starmer's leadership on COVID hasn't been distinct enough to show like another route out of COVID. So what are you really voting for if you're voting for a Labour seat on COVID? I'm not sure. So yeah, I think we'll have to see how it plays out. But I can see the Conservatives making gains on those Brexit Party voters.
Well, I think it's going to be very interesting to see on Thursday night. Just very quickly, one last question. I'm coming to you on this, Charlie. Obviously, we mentioned the Tees Valley mayoral election as well within this. It's taking place at the same time. Obviously, voters in Hartlepool will be voting in that, as well as voters in Stockton, Redcar and Cleveland, Middlesbrough and Darlington as well. Yeah. Internal polling the Labour Party had back in January put Ben Houchen on for a fairly comfortable victory. Do you agree with that?
I will quote my dad on this because he told me to register to vote, postally vote for the mayoral elections. And what he said was that the progressive vote is fairly strong because there's no Green Party candidate, there's no other left-wing candidate apart from Labour. And then the Tory candidate has been perceived to be like quite reasonable, quite progressive in the last few years. And considering how well Labour's been doing recently, I feel like there's a strong possibility that there will be a Tory mayor in Darlington and Tees Valley, which I am disappointed by, not gonna lie. The Tories don't really do anything for County Durham, but they're strengthening their grip on the area because the Treasury, the northern campus of the Treasury is there. They're cutting a lot of things there. It's not particularly great, but I can see that Labour's not going to do very well. It hasn't been doing very well for some years now.
Well, a full list of candidates in both elections are available online. The election takes place on Thursday. I'm aware we do need to at least try and give a full candidate list, so I will be publishing that in the comments throughout the show for both election. Sian, thank you very much. We'll be seeing you again very soon. Let's now bring in one last year's other station manager again this year, and of course a very big Line of Duty fan. So I do have to, of course, canvass her thoughts on that, given that she has actually watched the show compared to the rest of us here. Lucy Ferriby-Stocks, a very good afternoon to yourself.
Thank you for having me.
It's fantastic to have you on. Same two questions I've obviously asked every guest. Are we going to go to Tony Blair's hair firstly and Line of Duty?
Okay, Tony Blair's hair, I'm not a fan, I will admit. I do think he needs a bit of a haircut. I can see what he's trying to do. I know we've all been in the middle of lockdown, but I think Sherry needs to have a bit of a word, and get that sorted out. I agree with what Ollie said there. And then again with Line of Duty, as everybody knows, I am a fan of the show and have watched from the beginning. Last night, without any spoilers, I understand what some people are saying is disappointment but I can also understand what has been done and why Jed Mercurio has done what he has done with it. I think what you've got to think is the show is he tries to reflect the world we're in at the minute. So I think that should be sort of bear in mind. And also, I'm just a fan of the show because loads of the actors in it, including Vicky McClure, are from Nottingham, so I'm patriotic. I've got to have some benefit in there.
Of course, that is the most important thing.
Exactly.
I've just realised that again, Owen, it's quite a busy show. You do forget to add the wrong panelists sometimes. Sean, I'm so sorry about removing you there. As you can tell, the fun and the chaos of doing student radio. But let's now move on to another set of elections. Let's go on to the devolved parliaments now. And I guess there's a lot we could unpack from this. So, Lucy, let's start off with you. Obviously, the Scottish Parliament elections are taking place on Thursday as well. Polling at the moment seems to suggest that Nicola Sturgeon will be on for some form of either close to getting a parliamentary majority and forming a minority government or getting a majority within Holyrood. What do you think it will mean for independents if these polls are correct?
If these polls are correct and she manages to get a majority, I think that will be one of the top things on her agenda. Since the last referendum, she did not, obviously, for obvious reasons, did not like the outcome and sees sort of the current political landscape as being completely different as to what it was when the last referendum was had, with us having left the EU. So I can see that being a priority. I think what she's got to be careful of is it a priority for the rest of Scotland and your average Scottish voter? Because at the minute, independence might be nice if you believe in that, but under current circumstances with the pandemic, what people are going to be going through, so sort of how are they going to live their jobs, trying to find a sustainable future outside of the pandemic or moving forward with us having to live with COVID for a very long time. I think that is going to be on the forefront of people's minds rather than independence. So I think she's got to tread a very fine line for trying to balance that, which I think is going to be at the forefront of many people to the independence vote. And I also, obviously, from centrally within Westminster, she is going to get a lot of opposition from the Conservatives. Boris Johnson himself was all adamantly against a second referendum in Scotland.
Well, indeed. And I guess one of the key defining points about this election is how the agenda is trying to be framed by both parties. And we've seen, obviously, the SNP of the Conservatives have both made independence quite a significant part of their platforms, obviously from two very different sides. The Liberal Democrats have emphasised it as well. The Labour Party, interestingly, Charlie, Anna Sarwar, of course, new leader of the party from the start of the year, has tried to move the agenda away from independence towards issues like the NHS, towards public services, particularly given COVID over the last year. And certainly going by polling at the moment, it seems to be working for him.
Well, it's kind of natural to think that because independence has been talked about so much, especially since the last referendum, and it seems to be a bit of a pipe dream at the minute, I feel. Whereas the pandemic is very much real and there is a lot of pressure on the NHS, and that's at the front of quite a lot of people's minds. So it's kind of natural that if you're driving, I will improve these problems that are currently ongoing rather than I will strive to maybe do something, maybe. It'd sway me, definitely, if I was voting in these elections.
Well, I just want to bring in Enoch Makungu's comment now, because I think this is rather interesting. So Enoch has said the problem for unionist parties, well, most just the Conservatives, is that they have bought into the Nicola majority equals independence referendum rather than trying to focus on social policy and reforms. Also commenting that a 15-year-old government should not be this hard to run against. And I guess he does make a convincing point there, Sean, that the SNP have been in power for 15 years. There has been significant critique upon their record in public services, yet the emphasis from a lot of the parties has been on independence. So I guess that there is polling suggesting that if Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP do gain some form of majority or near to a majority, with the Alba Party potentially topping the pro-independence majority up, do you think there's potential for the Labour Party to become the second largest party in Scotland?
Do I think there's potential for Labour? I'm not convinced. I don't think that Labour could make significant gains in this election, but I could be very much wrong. I think in terms of Enoch's comment, I think definitely independence is the number one issue that's been framed in this election in Scotland. And I think that the problem for unionist parties like the Conservatives is there is a fear about it, and they want to be able to stand against that. Maybe you have potentially more left-leaning voters who are unionist, and they want to be able to vote for a party that is going to keep unionist. But also, I think I agree mostly with what Lucy was saying earlier, but I also think that independence is such a major issue in this election, specifically because of COVID. I think it's highlighted for the devolved nations just how much, in my opinion, the UK government is not out to protect devolved nations, and we've kind of been on our own. And I think for devolved nations, it's given them the most power they've had in years. So I think it's given a little taste of what independence could be like, and how that system could operate. So I think it's become even more of an issue than it has been ever before, particularly in Scotland and in Wales.
Well, let's stick with you now, Sian, and let's talk about Wales, because obviously the Welsh Parliament is being elected on Thursday as well. Now, polling there suggests that Mark Drayford could be on for a similar result to what he got in 2016, either or the just close to securing a majority, I believe just a small minority, potentially a majority as well. His leadership ratings have been rather favourable. People in Wales have generally responded well to his handling of the pandemic. So do you think that that could boost Drayford potentially in getting a majority?
I could be very wrong with my predictions of the Welsh government elections, but I think there is potential that this could be the first election in 22 years where Labour doesn't win a majority. I think it was 30-30 in the last election, but I could be wrong. But it was very close down the middle between Labour getting a majority or not. And I think where Nicola Sturgeon has probably made gains with support on leadership, I think Mark Drakeford hasn't come over particularly strong in some areas of COVID leadership. There's a kind of idea that we're always just 2 weeks behind what England does. That's just my opinion. I think that there is a need for looking at change. Like Enoch said, how is it so hard to run against a 15-year-old government? Well, in Wales, we're looking at a 22-year-old government. And I think there is kind of rufflings of change, whether that could be Plaid or a Conservative gain in Wales. I think, I don't know how it's going to go, but I think it could be very interesting how this election gets run.
No, certainly. And Charlie, I know you've got to go soon, so I'm going to come to you last on this point as we are pushed for time. Of course, Wales was another region in the last election where the Conservatives made considerable gains, arguably on the back of Brexit and also the unpopularity of the Labour Party at the time. Now, the Conservatives have ruled out going into a coalition agreement or some form of agreement with Plaid if that means they get in the Welsh government. So do you think then that that's very much entrenched, that there will be a Labour administration of some form in Wales post-Thursday?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I know the Red Wall has also disintegrated quite a lot in northern Wales, so there definitely seems to be some Tory gains going there. But I think it'll be tight. I can't divisively say whether I think that Labour or Tory will win the majority in Wales, mainly because I don't know much about how the Welsh devolved government works, but also it just seems like all these elections going on Thursday are going to be surprisingly tight.
Well, I think it will be certainly very interesting to see how that goes. Charlie, thank you very much for coming on the programme today. I know you have to go now.
Thank you for having me, and it's been great to go on, but goodbye.
No, thank you very much. And Sian as well, we will be seeing you again very soon. Now, I'm going to bring Will and Ollie back very shortly, but as I have Lucy here now, let's move on to the West Midlands elections and to London. We'll come on to the West Midlands very shortly, but let's start off with the London mayoral election. And I guess my question to you is, Is it almost a foregone conclusion that Sadiq Khan will be mayor of London on Thursday?
I like how you start with these easy questions. I think that it's not as foregone a conclusion as was previously thought. So I do think that the rise of sort of more in the fact that how long the ballot paper is for this current London mayor election, I think is evidence of that. The amount of people that are currently on this ballot paper, sort of standing on completely different extremes, completely different policies. You've got the likes of Sadiq Khan, you've got Sean Bailey, obviously the two heavyweights, and then you've got YouTubers joining, you've got Lawrence Fox, you've got all sorts of different types of people standing completely different policies. So I think that in itself shows that it's not a foregone conclusion. There isn't a clear lead, there isn't a clear ideology or a clear set of beliefs that people have complete faith in, as other people felt the need to stand forward and represent a certain group's thoughts or opinions. I do think it is likely that Sadiq Khan will win the election. I do think that is looking more and more likely, but I don't think it will be as as big as majority as he would potentially like. And I do think that is a result of other individuals standing. Obviously, they're taking votes from him. Obviously, that's going to be the same for the Tories as well. They've got people such as Lawrence Fox standing on a much more right-wing agenda, completely against the current or the last year of COVID restrictions and the government's handling of the pandemic, whether you agree with him or not. But that is, again, representing a traditionally right-wing voting group, which won't do them any good. So I don't think it's a completely foregone conclusion, because I don't think Sadiq Khan is completely in the clear. But I do think that it is, it's heading in that direction.
Well, it's important to say that polling has put Sadiq Khan's first round vote down from 2016, although, of course, it is the supplementary vote system in which, of course, all candidates give their first and second choice preferences, and then second preferences are reallocated to the top two candidates if no majority is reached in the first round. And I guess, Will, there's a lot of diversity within the London mayor election, as Lucy touched upon, a varied set of policies, a completely varied set of ideas being put forward as well. Do you think perhaps that the London mayoral election will be an opportunity, and perhaps where we'll get the most insights into particular opposition towards both the government and the opposition's handling of COVID, particularly as we see with Lawrence Fox and the lockdowns?
I think it's hard to say at the moment. I do think Sadiq Khan will probably win. It might not be in the first round now, simply because of the support for some of the independent candidates. Obviously, you've got Nico Omilana, who's seemed to have galvanised the youth vote and sort of taking those votes away from Sadiq Khan. Obviously, you've still got Sean Bailey, who has had some interesting moments in the past in his campaign, such as he ignored a homeless man, which wasn't great to see. It's hard to say, because I think the London election is a bit more isolated from outside of Westminster politics, especially because it's perceived to have a lot more power. I think it's probably one of the most powerful positions, independent of Westminster. So I think what you're going to see is more of a referendum or more of an opinion poll on how Sadiq Khan was doing. But obviously, I think enough people think he's doing well enough, so he probably will be re-elected.
Okay, Ollie, let's come to you now. Let's move on to the West Midlands. And I guess, obviously, we started off talking about the Red Bull. We're going to finish off talking about the Red Bull. The West Midlands mayoral election in 2017 was seen by many commentators at the time as the first real example of the fall from, or the move of voters from Labour to the Conservatives over issues such as Brexit and increased frustration with the Labour Party. Polling is very tight, though. Andy Street, at the moment, the Conservative candidate, has a small lead over the Labour candidate, Liam Byrne. I guess my question to you is, how do you believe this election is going to go? And also, what do you believe the wider ramifications are dependent upon the result?
Well, I think before anything, I think it's worth saying that Labour should never have lost it really in 2017 when it was first fought. I think the polling ahead of that was widely predicted that Labour, it should be a majority that Labour should win, but then they selected a terrible candidate in Sean Simon, and the campaign was even worse. And as you say, the Tories ended up winning, and the time of it was convenient because I think it was a few days before the Tory campaign in 2017 started to implode. So I think you are right when you say it was kind of an example of where the Red Wall first started to fall. But I mean, I would argue actually that many years before you can trace back to the first step. So I mean, I think this time around though, I think it's going to be tight again. I think if I had to put money on it, which I'm not going to do, but if I had to say one way or the other, I think Andy Sheep will probably retain it. I mean, I think Liam Byrne is a far better candidate for Labour this time than last time, but I think overall last time there was about 3,500 votes in it, which is extraordinary given the size of the electorate there. But no, I think Andy Sheep's interesting because he's always kind of his image has always been, I'm not a typical politician like he used to be. He was the managing director of John Lewis, I think, which was ironic given recent events. But no, I think he will slightly. I think we'll just edge it again. And as I say, if Labour don't win it, then it will just be another thing on top of potentially Hartlepool or not winning a majority in the Welsh Assembly, which will just kind of add more and more pressure onto Keir to and the idea that things haven't changed enough in a year and he needs to go further. But I think it's also worth mentioning that I think Labour's still in kind of a detoxification stage, not in a stage where they I think it's too early personally to be reaching out to voters that they need to regain trust with. I think at the moment we're still in a phase of making the party just detoxify. So I'm not making
we appear to be having some internet issues at the moment. I think your internet has just come back, but we're going to have to move on now to obviously our next topic. So again, absolutely fine. It's technology. I am well known to not enjoy modern technology. So there we go. That is the local elections taking place on Thursday. You've heard all of the things across different elections across the country. Of course, remember that there are elections that you can vote in. As Warwick students, more details available on our website, where we will be publishing the results across all our social medias as the evening unfolds. Let's move away now from the local elections. Let's move away from the UK. Let's go to Joe Biden now very quickly. His first 100 days came to a close last Friday, where he gave his first address to a joint session of Congress. Quite a lot to talk about, really. So I guess, Will, let's start off with you, because there's been a lot of people obviously talking about the Biden presidency, really expressing it as a very different presidency so far to Donald Trump's. In what ways would you say that is true, and how?
I think you're just seeing more stability at the moment. I think obviously with Trump, you seem to not be able to go a week without some form of news story that implicated someone or something within his administration. And I think just this new administration just seems a bit more stable. Obviously, they've got the benefit of having been in a bit of a recovery period, so that everything's looking up COVID-wise. They're getting vaccines rolled out quite quickly, and obviously they've got the massive spending on infrastructure bills that have been passed, and I think another one is going to be passed, or they're trying to push it through Congress. It will be interesting to see how it goes over the next few months, because once COVID's sort of over and the spending needs to be paid for, he might face a bit more opposition than he's currently experiencing at the moment.
Well, it's fair to say that this is an administration that has got quite a bit done so far. You mentioned the infrastructure bills, you mentioned the COVID recovery package as well. Lucy, there have been many people who have said, people on the left, especially the Democrat Party, who have said that they found Biden a lot more transformational, a lot more radical than even they could have possibly thought of. Is that something you would agree with?
The thing is, Biden was always going to have an incredibly big job to do, and anything that he did would be seen as transformational as compared to the previous 4 years with a Trump presidency. So I think that does need to be borne in mind. I I don't think it's surprising in a way, because this level of change was arguably needed with the onset of the pandemic, for America to start maybe setting a direction for coming out of the pandemic. You know, the sheer scale of their vaccine rollout has been immense. And also, as Will talked about, you know, the amount of money that they are investing into the COVID recovery, and it's next levels of funding that they are putting in that hasn't been seen before. You know, people are going back in the UK and in the US comparing this to sort of post-war time, and arguably it is, you know, it's completely different, you know, circumstances, but the amount of intervention that is needed from a government during a time like this, both socially and economically especially, is unprecedented. So I think anything that Biden would have done would have been seen as transformational compared to the last 4 years. And I also want to acknowledge one thing. You know, it was the first time that a president stood at that podium and said Madam Vice President and Madam Speaker at the same time, which I think, you know, as something else that is worth mentioning, it's a more positive side, I think, showing America moving in the right direction.
Absolutely, of course, a very monumental moment indeed for women in politics in the United States. Sean, of course, as Lucy was talking about a lot of these developments that have been taking place under the Biden administration so far. We mentioned the spending on, I think, $1,400 given to every American as part of these packages, potentially up to £6 trillion of infrastructure spending being announced in that speech. A lot of Republicans who had sort of previously found Biden someone that they felt they could compromise with, someone that they would sort of go eye to eye with previously, a lot of Republicans watching that speech seemed to be rather, I say rather demure reaction, one that wasn't seen to be best pleased. And of course, America being a society that does seem increasingly polarized politically, do you think that the Republicans are increasingly finding that they're going to find less common ground under the Biden administration?
Yeah, so first off, I am notorious on Insight for being the politics student that doesn't watch the news. So I'm really sorry if anything I say is completely random. But I think that the middle ground in American politics has been shifting for the last 20 years, and I think it will continue to shift. I think some of Biden's policies and announcements have been completely I don't want to say radical, but on the radical side. For instance, his 2050 climate pledge. You know, I specialize in climate change, and I think that's pretty awesome. But the fact that he's kind of locked down the next 10 years of presidents to this kind of pledge is really interesting, and I can see how that would really bother some on the center Republicans even. But I think middle ground is not happening in America at all. And Biden could have been the middle ground, but I think he's taking the chance while he has a Democratic majority in the House and Senate to really make changes, which I think is great.
Well, of course, as you said, the Biden presidency's obviously done a lot so far, but I guess looking ahead, what more can it do? Ollie, I'm going to put that question to you. Of course, Biden presidency. I'm sorry, no easy questions on Insight. Of course, we're 100 days into the Biden presidency at the moment, and we've started to see, for example, over the last month, some potential foreign policy issues come to the forefront with regards to Ukraine, with regards to North Korea and Iran as well. Of course, there's the continued infrastructure spending and how Biden's going to be able to carry that off. And there still remains questions over whether Joe Biden will be the Democrat Party candidate in 2024. So I guess listening kind of over all of that, what do you think are the biggest challenges that are going to be facing the Biden presidency now we've got through the first 100 days?
I think the obvious one is, recovery from the pandemic, because obviously we're not all safe until everyone is safe, are we? So as much as the US vaccination program has been, it's been amazing, really, hasn't it, over the past since the beginning of the year. I think there's still a long way to go, in that regard. And then I think going forward, it's just the other big challenge of the day in terms of climate change and combating terrorism. So, I think it's not an easy challenge, and I think having the pandemic on top of normal problems has been difficult. So it'll just be interesting to see how how things go over the next 4 years. I think it is worth mentioning, though, that I think it was just brought up about the Democrats just having the minority kind of swing in the Senate, and obviously in 2 years' time that might not necessarily. Have I got this wrong? Have I completely? Is it the House of Representatives? It's every 2 years.
House of Representatives every 2 years, but a third of the Senate does go up as well, and that
Exactly.
could easily go back to the Republicans.
And if that in 2 years' time goes back towards the Republicans, then, as I say, you might find another brick wall like Obama did for much of his presidency. So I think there's a lot going through at the moment, and I think it'll be like that for a lot of the next 2 years, because it'll be a case of trying to get as much through as you can before the next set of elections. But I think so far so good, really.
Well, it is important to say on that point that typically in the midterm elections at the start of a new presidential administration, it is the opposition party to the president that does tend to make those gains. So maybe Joe Biden does only have a year and a half to get his plans through. Enoch Bukungu has just commented, and we're going to finish on this point, that voting reform has to be the chief priority. And I now feel like I want to have a cry, because that is the essay that I now need to finish this show to go back onto. Thank you very much, Enoch, for commenting. And thank you very much for watching and listening to the show wherever you have been today. It's been fantastic to have your company. Again, make sure if you are eligible, you've registered to vote in your local elections this week. As we said, all the details, we'll be covering it here on Raw 12:51 AM. Thanks very much for your company. I hope you have a lovely day, and thanks for tuning in.